How about now? I think we're going to have to invest in a new mic. Snatch it out of my head. I'll, after I finish with the map, we'll go there. All right. It is good to see everybody and glad that you're with us, and those that are online, thank you for joining us. So if you take your Bibles, we're going to be in Judges chapter 18. While you're doing that, let me mention this. We won't meet next week due to Thanksgiving. So we'll meet again 2 weeks from today. I guess we'll be into December by that time, won't we? So I'm not even sure what that date will be. But anyway, Lord willing, we'll be here and we'll continue our study. So I do want to go ahead and before we get started, take care of a couple of things on the map. Just kind of lay out some things to the study, at least have some frame of reference where we're at. So here's an interesting thing. So much of what we've been talking about, especially since we've been dealing with Samson, is all in this vicinity right here. Here's Dan, all right? And this is Benjamin. Here's Ephraim. And so with the exception of when Samson went down to Gaza, everything that we've been in now for quite some time is located in that area. But a few things that I want to just point out, some locations, cities that we're going to be mentioning tonight while we're making our way through the study. Now, you've heard of, I've made reference to Zorah and Eshtaol. We made reference to that a few times back during the time we were studying Samson. Also, there is a Kiriath Jearim right here. It's in Benjamin, that more yellowish spot right there, and the orange is Dan. Ephraim, we're going to make reference to that again. And then we're also, tonight, going to be making reference to a city by the name of Laish, but if you have one of the maps that I've provided, it will be labeled as Dan. So we're going to find out how Dan ended all the way up here when he started out down here. All right, so we're going to be talking about that tonight. That's really one of the things that's key to what we're going to be studying this evening. And then also another term that we'll make reference to is a place called Maccanae Dan, and it is called the Camp of Dan, which we'll make reference to, and it's right in this same vicinity where Benjamin and Dan, where they intersect with one another, okay? So just want to go ahead and get that out of the way and not have to replace my microphone in the process of doing so, all right? Okay, so before we actually get on into the study, let me mention this real quick. So the story of what's going on here with the tribe of Dan is very much connected with Samson. Because as I mentioned a week or so ago, maybe it was last week, Samson's the last of the judges that's mentioned in the book of Judges. Now Samuel is the last of the judges and the first of the Old Testament prophets, okay? So the time of the judges end with Samuel and the time of the prophets begin with Samuel, all right? But that's in the books, one of the books that follow. But they are tied, because here's an interesting thing. As we went through, and so many times, we saw the strange, contradictory ways in which Samson behaved himself, all the carnality, just all the stuff that he was into. What we come to find out is that maybe his mom and dad, they seemed to be pretty level-headed, devout, as best we could tell, worshipers of Yahweh. But what affected the mindset and the attitude that guided and directed Samson seemed to be symptomatic of the entire tribe of Dan. And you see how that plays out as we make our way through this. So it's almost like what we're seeing here with Dan is sort of an elaboration or a blowing up on a bigger level of the kind of mindset and thinking that characterized Samson. And so I just want to remind you that in these last 5 chapters, from chapter 17 to the end of the book, that these are just accounts that have been added at the conclusion of the book of Judges to help us appreciate just how spiritually adrift, and even depraved that Israel had become by this time. So you kind of get an idea. So when Samuel comes on the scene as the first prophet, you get an idea of what is going on and what he's dealing with and so forth, and the challenge that he's got before him. So what we have is this: the tribe of Dan, that's down here, middle of the country. Remember when we were going through and talking about the tribal allotments in the book of Joshua, we pointed out how Ephraim is pretty much located right in the heart of the nation, on the west side of the Jordan. Well, you can see that Dan's very close there. And Micah. So remember Micah, we talked about last week, the man who ends up creating this shrine and these idols, and he enlists his own Levite to serve as his priest. All of that's happening right in the heart of the country. I mean, it's right in the middle of the country, all right? So it gives us an idea of just how messed up that Israel had become. And it takes things to another level, as we'll see as we get to the end of the study tonight. So let's go ahead and get started. In verses 1 through 6, we're going to talk about this, a little bit of a review. I finished up last week with these verses. But we see here where the Danites are introduced to Micah's idolatry. And so as we come to the end of chapter 17, remember Micah, this man who takes these idols, he builds a shrine, he makes his own son a priest until eventually he finds a Levite to come and to serve there. Well, he's got his thing going on, and that's there in the hill country of Ephraim, all right? So remember, here's what he's done. He has created a rival tabernacle, a rival place, or at least his own centralized place of worship that is a rival to the tabernacle that's located in Shiloh. And if you remember last week, one of the things we talked about is this: he's got multiple idols. But remember, we started out in the early part of chapter 17, there's this interaction that goes on between him and his mother. He steals 11,000 shekels of silver, brings it back to Mom. Mom ends up saying, well, I'm going to give you 200 of these. Go have either a wooden and a molten idol made, or it might have been a wooden idol covered with silver or something like that, all right? You go do that. And so out of that, he ends up creating this shrine, but there's a high probability that this particular idol that's being discussed there in the early part of chapter 17 is intended to represent Yahweh, the God of Israel. Just like Aaron, the golden calf. Remember in the wilderness? And he said, here's your God, Israel. So in other words, he had done exactly what God forbids. You do not make an image to represent me and so he's not only got idols, likely he has an idol that's supposed to represent Yahweh, okay? So we come to chapter number 18. And so in verses 1 through 6, we see where and how the Danites are introduced to Micah's idolatry. It says, beginning in verse 1, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. And in those days the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in. For until that day their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them. So the children of Dan sent 5 men of their family from their territory, men of valor, from Zorah and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and search it. And they said, go and search the land. Now remember, last week we talked about the reason why they're doing this. Does anybody remember what the purpose was? They had not gone in when they received their allotment. Area that you see over there below Ephraim, the orange, that's Dan, okay? They had not gone into the land and finished driving out the Canaanites. Amorites in their particular instance, which was just one of the many tribes we call Canaanites. And the Amorites had driven Dan, all the inhabitants of Dan, up into the hill country. And the Amorites ruled the So they had the farming and everything else. So Dan had not stepped up. They didn't have the faith, and they didn't have the courage to go and do what God had told them to do, drive out the Canaanites, all right? So they've decided, we're going to move somewhere else. Or at least, now here's the question. Is the entire tribe of Dan, is everybody moving? Is it just a part of it? Is it half of them? We don't know that for certain, all right? But what we do know is that at least a portion of the tribe of Dan are the people that are involved in this, and they're the ones that are working on making this move up to the North Country, all right? So soon after they start their search, they have an encounter with the house of Micah and the Levite, remember, that serving as priests. So we read in verse number 2, it says, so they went to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. And while they were at the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. They turned aside and said to him, "Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? And what do you have here?" Now, they recognized his voice. How? We don't know exactly. All right? Maybe it was an accent. Maybe they've encountered him somewhere. But somebody recognizes a voice. They recognize an accent. Know somehow it's out of place. And so they want to know, what are you doing here? And if you remember, in chapter 17, when we're introduced to this Levite, he's from Bethlehem of Judah. But here's what we're told of him, that he is going to find a place to stay, which really meant he was looking for a place of employment. And there was really no reason for him to do that, because remember, you got all those Levitical cities all over the place. God had provided places for them to live and to work. So what he's doing is he's out taking his skills as a Levite, and he's looking for somebody just like Micah, basically. He's looking for an opportunity he can use his skills as a Levite, okay? And so in verse number 4 says, and he said to them, "Thus and so Micah did for me. He's hired me. I've become his priest." And so they said to him, "Please inquire of God that which we go will be prosperous." And the priest said to them, "Go in peace. The presence of the Lord will be with you on your way." And so they say, "Pray for us." And then he gives them a blessing in the name of the Lord. And you want to know something? It wasn't worth a wood nickel. And they should have known. And I would dare say, not only should, they would have known what he's doing. Something here is not right. The smell test, they don't pass the smell test. But they were not the least bit concerned about it. They're just embracing. So that kind of made me think for just a few minutes, because, basically you've got a guy here who is supposedly interceding for others in the name of the Lord, and that he's blessing others in the name of the Lord, and he's playing this role and so forth. And they fell for it. They embraced it. But that is a that we need to be reminded of, because there's always wolves in sheep clothing. There's always pretenders. There's always wannabes. Jesus said this, just as a reminder. In Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 24 concerning the end times, his disciples had come to the Lord, "When shall these things be? What's the sign of your coming?" and so forth and so on. And if you go in and you read and you study that chapter, Jesus doesn't necessarily immediately answer their particular questions, but he basically goes on and says, "Here's what you really need to know, guys." But then he says this in Matthew chapter 24, verse 23. And of course, obviously, he's talking about tribulation, great tribulation, so forth and so on. But he says, if Christ or there, he says, do not believe it. False Christ and false prophets. See, I have beforehand. And here's what I say, that what Jesus says about the end times applies to the present as well. When you have people that are making claims think about this. You know, you all remember the Branch Davidians and David Koresh? You know who David Koresh claimed to be, don't you? He claimed to be the Messiah. And look at what a disaster that was on so many levels. But people that were just and so forth. If anybody claims to be Jesus, if they claim to be the Messiah, if they claim to be Christ, if they new revelations, I touched on this back a few weeks ago when exactly on what, probably in the book of Ephesians, I'm sure it was. But if you get somebody who comes along, I gave you the example of a man that I heard on television with my own ears and saw it with my own eyes about a man who said, if you think this is all God has to say, you are mistaken. There's plenty more things God has to reveal besides what's in the Bible. Listen, my advice is run. Exactly what these guys should have done with this Levite. They should have run. You just got to beware. I mean, Paul talks about, itching ears. So you've got to beware. Those guys should have known. They should have rebuked that Levite. They should have rebuked Micah, that whole situation, or taken them out behind the woodshed or worse, whatever it might have been. But what they did was the worst thing that could have been done, which was to condone and to embrace it. So then we come to 12. And we see where the Danites choose the city of Laish. So they've sent out these 5 spies, all right? Verse 7. Or these 5 reconnaissance. They're out on a reconnaissance. So the 5 men, verse 7, the 5 men departed and went to Laish. So they left Zorah, Eshtaol, that area down there around southeast Ephraim, Dan, and so forth, and they started traveling north, and they traveled all the way to the most northern part of Israel, where no other Israelites were at, okay? So they went to Laish, because that's what that city originally was called. Now watch this. Listen to this right here. They saw the people who were there, how they dwelt safely. So there apparently was not any impending threat from, another kingdom or tribes or whatever up there. In the manner of the Sidonians, they were quiet and secure. Now listen to this statement right here. There were no rulers in the land who might put them to shame for anything. I find that to be really interesting. They were far from the Sidonians, and they had no ties with anyone. And so basically, they occupied a remote section that belonged to the Sidonians, but nobody was living there. It was too far away for anybody to come and want to have to deal with it, and so it was a spot for them. And by the way, these so they've made their trip to the north. Now we come to verse 8. The spies come back to their brethren at Zorah and Eshtaol. And their brethren said to them, so they said, arise, let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and indeed it's very good. Would you do nothing? In other words, would you just sit here and do nothing with this great opportunity in front of us? Don't hesitate. Enter to possess the land. When you go, you will come to a secure people in a large land, for God has given it into your hands, where there is no lack of anything that is on the earth. Interesting. Now listen, is God allowing this to transpire and take place? Yes, God is allowing, but there is nowhere in the record whatsoever that God has initiated anything here. Nothing. This is totally initiated by men. Verse 11. Men of the family of the Danites from Zorah and Eshtaol, and armed with weapons of war. Now, eventually they're going to make their way up there to northern Israel, to Laish, that I showed you just a few minutes ago, which eventually becomes called Dan, all right? But do you not see something strange here? they can manage to muster up an army of 600 men to travel all the way from down here, clear up yonder, to go fight and possess a land, okay? But they couldn't do it right here in the front door. Is that not interesting? To them, that seems logical. Let's forget all this, throw in the towel, let's relocate and go up here. It just does it. But yet, that's exactly what they're doing. So we go on to verse number 12. So before they make their way up there, they went and encamped in Kiriath Jearim, which I showed you a minute ago, there in Judah. It's right at the edge of Benjamin. And therefore they call that place Mahanao Dan, Camp of Dan, to this day. There it is west of Kiriath Jearim. All right? So before they make their trip, we come to verses 13 through 26. The Danites steal Micah's idols. They were introduced to this early part of the chapter. Here they decide to take them and make them their own. Now think about this before we go any further, all right? They're going to seize these idols, load them up, haul them all the way up north of Israel, create a new city and state for them, set up these idols, and worship them. And they're calling this God. Is that not just mind-boggling of how blind that people can become? Look at verse 13. And they passed from the mountains of Ephraim, and they came to the house of Micah. And the 5 men who had gone to spy Laish answered and said to them, do you know that there are in these houses an ephod, household idols, a carved image, and a molded image? Now therefore consider what you do. So they turned aside there, and they came to the house of the young Levite, to the house of Micah, and they greeted him. The 6 men armed with their weapons of war, who were of the children of Dan, stood by the entrance of the gate. And the 5 men who had gone to spy the land also went up. Entering there, they took the carved image, the ephod, the household idols, the molded image. The priest stood at the entrance of the gate with the 600 men who were armed with weapons of war. And when these took the carved image, the ephod, the household idols, the molded image, the priest said, what are you doing? And they said, be quiet and put your hand over your mouth. Now that was not a suggestion. That was a threat. If you know what's good for you, shut your mouth. All right? And come with us and be a father and a priest to us. Is it better for you to be a priest to the household of man, or that you be a priest to a tribe and a family in Israel? So the priest's heart was glad, and he took the ephod, the household idols, the carved images, and took his place among the people, little ones, livestock, and the goods in front of them. So now listen. So now that Levite there, and what are you doing, was not out of loyalty to Micah. He was concerned that his gig is up. Isn't it interesting how quickly his attitude changed when they offered him the job? He got a promotion, okay? More money, more suits of clothes, all that kind of stuff, all right? And so, you know, and he also, so there was no loyalty there. It's kind of my point. There was no loyalty to Micah, which kind of reminds me of, and most of us here are old enough to appreciate what I'm going to say. It reminds me a whole lot of what I have seen change in church in America. So many things, some for the good, most maybe not for the good. But one of the things I have seen change among different generations is the lack of loyalty in churches. I mean, people had just as soon cut ties and move on as soon as something doesn't go their way, or there's a little bit of a wave here and there, or they don't get their way. I mean, there used to be a day when people actually believed in a thing called loyalty and loyalty to their churches. Now, I get it. There are times to leave if God's moving you. But way too often today, it's got nothing to do with God moving you. It's about, it's greener somewhere else, it's easier, it's better somewhere else, whatever the case may be. And you see what he's doing is how his attitude changed when he realized that he's going to get a promotion. His attitude changed, which says he was serving for what Paul called filthy lucre. And that's something that the New Testament talks about. Anybody involved in ministry, especially if you're in pastoral ministry and so forth and so on, and that kind of thing, that your motivation can never be about money. That can't be the primary motive that you have in your life. But yet he did. It reminded me of a story I heard. Had a staff member on the mountain. He was telling me the story that when he was in college, he attended the college over in Sweetwater. And I think it was a 2-year Methodist college over in Sweetwater. Hiwassee or somewhere, over in that area somewhere. But anyway, he was a great pianist and just really good worship music, leading the choir. He was fantastic. But he was young. He was college age. So he's over there going to college. He sees an ad for a position in one of the larger churches over there in the Sweetwater area. And so he applies, and he gets a phone call from the pastor. I'd like to sit down and talk with you. So he goes, and he sits down in the pastor's office and gets talking to the pastor, and the pastor gets to know him, and he says, well, tell me a little bit about yourself and how long you've been playing, blah, blah, blah. And then he says this. He says, the pastor says, well, tell me about your calling. When did God call you to ministry? And so he shares all that information with him and everything. And so after they talked for a little bit, the pastor said, I want to offer you the position. I think you do a fantastic job. You'd be a great addition to our music ministry here. But my buddy, he said, conversation about compensation or anything of that nature whatsoever. So what kind of compensation comes with the position? Interesting. The pastor said, oh, there is none. It's for free. You'll be doing it for free. And my buddy looks at him and he says, really? He says, yeah. He says, you said God called you to ministry. You ought to do it for free. So my buddy says to him, he says, well, what about you? And the pastor responds. The pastor said to him, oh, God didn't call me to ministry. I chose this as a vocation, so that's why I get paid. He said that. God didn't call me. I chose this as a vocation. Isn't that mind-boggling? You never know what. Too about a story I heard on in Los Angeles. Heard about 3 of them were close by, and he went up to them. He wanted to ask them about what were they doing and what did they take. Well, the first 2 just cussed him out and didn't tell him nothing. They just went on. Their third guy comes out and he asks him, he says, well, what did you take? The guy says, oh, I got some gospel music. I love Jesus. So here's the thing looking for, which was a man-made religion. Remember that song that we read of the 5 spies, the 5 guys that went on the tour to check out a place for them, and they sent word back and said, here's a place where nobody will shame us for anything. In other words, nobody's going to question us, nobody's going to challenge us, nothing's going to convict us, nobody's going to tell us that we're guilty of sin. Nobody's going to tell us you ought not be worshiping idols. You can't have an idol that represents Yahweh. You get the idea. Verse 22. From the house of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house gathered together. And they called out to them, so they turned around and said, what ails you? They said to Micah, what ails you that you have gathered such a company? And so he said, you have taken away my gods, which I made. Amazing. You've taken my gods, which I made. And the priests gone away. Now what more do I have? How can you say to me, what ails you? Verse 20 said to him, do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry men fall upon you and you lose your life and the lives of your household. And then the children of Dan went their way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went to the house. So he realized there was nothing he could do about this situation. But now here's the climax of the whole thing, all right? Watch this. Verses 27 through 31. So they've been introduced to idolatry. They steal Micah's idolatry. But watch where this goes. They officially adopt idolatry. Verse 27 says this. So they took the maid and the priest who had belonged to him, went to Laish, to a people quiet and secure. I would describe this area up there where the Sidonians were, Laish, this safe and secure, nobody's rocking the boat. Obviously the Sidonians there, they're pagans. I would describe it like the West Coast, Oregon, Washington. Those, I mean, really, that place is messed up. Those are some spiritually dark places in America. Okay? So, and they struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. There was no deliverer because it was far from Sidon, and they had no ties with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob. So they built the city and dwelt there, and they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan their father, who was born to Israel. However, the name of the city formerly was Laish. And so when Dan is established up there in the northern part of the country, you in the scriptures from Dan to Beersheba, that was intended to talk about the extreme northern point of the nation of Israel as a whole and the extreme southern point of the nation of Israel as a whole. All right? Verse 30. Then the children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image, and Jonathan, now look at this, and Jonathan the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan, and maybe this is the name of that Levite. We don't really know. That might be the name of that Levite that was there, okay? And his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. Now, do you know what he's talking about there, the captivity of the land? You know what he's making reference to? That is the northern part of the northern kingdom. We'll talk about this in just a few minutes, all right? That was destroyed and carried captive by the Assyrians in 722 BC, all right? We'll talk more about that in just a minute. So they themselves Micah's carved image, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. They were rejecting essentially the worship of God that was sanctioned by God, the worship at Shiloh, which is down in this vicinity, further down around Ephraim and so forth in that area. And they have sanctioned their own temple, their own priesthood, completely apart and in rebellion against everything that God's word teaches. But here's the thing. Here's what I want you to understand. What they have done is this. They have gone, up until this time, here's what you've got. Even with Micah, okay? Idolatry was widespread in Israel. But it was done on an individual basis. Here's what they do at Dan. They officially sanction idolatry as the religion of an entire tribe of the Jews, of a city established by Jews. They have completely sanctioned and made idolatry the official religion of the tribe of Dan and the city of Dan. All right? Now, it's amazing how some things happened in the past that may not seem like it's such a big deal, but it can lay a foundation, sometimes for something that is good, oftentimes for something that is not good. This is one of those such instances. Could Micah and his mother have ever imagined that when she sent him with those 200 shekels to have this idol made, that how he would then turn it into a shrine and these Danites would get exposed to it, and then they would like it so much that they would decide to take it captive and make it their own and move it up into the north country and relocate and reestablish, whether it be the entire tribe of Dan or just part of them, and they established this city. But they took that and they sanctioned this idol worship as their official religion. But it doesn't stop there, because once Dan did that, idolatry has really taken a stronghold in the nation of Israel. It doesn't stop there. Remember, after Solomon died, right? Remember, God had said that the nation would be rent in two upon the death of Solomon. All right? And God was bringing judgment upon the house of David and upon Solomon and so forth because of some decisions and choices and wrong actions and so forth and so on. But God says, I'll not do it until after your son dies, Solomon. So when Solomon dies, the nation is divided. Northern kingdom, southern kingdom. The northern kingdom becomes, it's called Israel. Samaria becomes the capital city. The southern kingdom is known as Judah, and the capital city is Jerusalem. The northern kingdom quickly goes off the ledge. Jeroboam, who became the king over the northern kingdom. Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, became the king of Judah. Here's what Jeroboam did. He said to himself, we've got this division in the land. I don't want my tribes in the northern part of the kingdom, don't want them longing for Jerusalem and for the temple. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set up an altar and a place of worship in the northern part of the nation, in the city of Dan, and I'm going to set one up of the northern kingdom at Bethel. And he set up idols, golden calves, of all things, golden calves. And basically, what's he doing? Where did he learn this idea from? He got it from Dan, and he got it from Aaron. And man, the northern kingdom after that, man, you talk about off the cliff, off the ledge, fast. They went down fast, wholly and completely given over to idolatry and everything that goes along with it. So much so that God finally said, I'm done with you. I am done. And God brought the Assyrians upon the northern kingdom, and they destroyed and completely wiped out the northern kingdom. And all that was left was Judah. They brought foreigners in. They planted foreigners in the northern kingdom. They took the best of the Jews that was left and they hauled them off into captivity to Assyria. They left only the weakest, the poorest, the least of the population among the Jews that were in the northern kingdom. They began to intermarry with the foreigners that the Assyrians had planted there. And that's the reason why, when you get to Jesus' day, that there's such a clash between Jews and the Samaritans, because the Samaritans were half-breeds, and they still had remnants of the effects of all the influence of Assyria and everything that had transpired. They still suffered from it, even in the days of Jesus. That's how much God hates idolatry. The southern kingdom did okay for a while, but even the southern kingdom eventually began going down that same path. And in 586 BC, not too many years after the northern kingdom was taken out, God took out the southern kingdom, took them into captivity to Babylon for 70 years. But now, in faithfulness to his word, God began restoring the nation after 70 years. Here's all of this going on with my transpired. And by the way, time in Dan, what's going on in Dan at this point, to the time when in 722, you're only talking about 175 years. 175 years. And God completely wiped away the northern kingdom. It's kind of a heavy ending, isn't it? Let me summarize it like this. God is a jealous God. And make no mistake about it, God will not share his people with false gods. All right, any questions, thoughts? All right. Thank you all for joining us online. Have a blessed evening. All right, Brother Andy, I'll turn it over to you, brother.